On the evening of the 5th of December 1952, Londoners stepped out of their homes into what appeared to be an ordinary winter fog. By the time the air finally cleared 5 days later, thousands lay dead, and Britain would never be the same again. This is the story of how a perfect storm of weather, industry and complacency created the deadliest peacetime disaster in British history, one that transformed the way we think about the very air we breathe. Chapter 1. The Yellow Wall Descends. The first hints of trouble arrived quietly, almost politely, as befitted the British capital in those austere post-war years. Friday, 5th December 1952, began as an unremarkable winter's day in London. Shoppers bustled along Oxford Street, preparing for Christmas. Office workers hurried through their final hours before the weekend. Across the city, tens of thousands of coal fires were being stoked in homes, factories and power stations, sending plumes of smoke into the still air above. Mrs. Elsie Meadows, a district nurse in Stepney, later recalled finishing her afternoon rounds without incident. "The fog was just starting to come down as I cycled home," she remembered in a 1982 interview. "Nothing unusual for December in London. We were quite used to our pea soupers in those days. Rather romantic, some people thought." But what was gathering over London that evening was no ordinary fog. A high-pressure weather system had settled over the Thames Valley, creating what meteorologists call a temperature inversion. Cold air was trapped beneath a layer of warmer air, forming an invisible lid over the city. Into this atmospheric prison, London poured its daily output of pollution: smoke from 250,000 domestic coal fires, emissions from countless factories, exhaust from diesel buses and lorries, and the thick, sulphurous output from Battersea and Fulham power stations. By nightfall, visibility had dropped to a few yards. But this was merely the overture to what was to come. Saturday morning revealed a city transformed. The fog had thickened overnight into something altogether more sinister. It was no longer grey, but yellow, a dense, acrid blanket that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. Londoners who had lived through the Blitz found themselves reaching for wartime comparisons. This was different, though. The enemy was invisible, and there was no shelter from it. Albert Morrison, a taxi driver from Bermondsey, attempted to drive his black cab through the streets that morning. "I couldn't see the bonnet of my own vehicle," he told reporters years later. "I had to get out and walk in front with a torch, guiding myself along. Even then I kept bumping into lampposts. After half an hour I gave up and went home. The smell was terrible, like someone had set fire to every dustbin in London." The smog penetrated everywhere. It seeped through the gaps around windows and doors, filling homes with its choking presence. At the Sadler's Wells Theatre, a performance of La Traviata was abandoned when the audience could no longer see the stage. At the Smithfield show at Earl's Court, prize cattle collapsed and died in their stalls, their lungs unable to cope with the toxic air. The animals, at least, would be among the first casualties officially recorded. Transport ground to a halt. Buses were abandoned mid-route. The underground became a refuge for those desperate to escape the surface, though even below ground, the air grew thick and foul. At Liverpool Street Station, trains arriving from the clearer air of the countryside were met by passengers coughing and wheezing on the platforms. In hospitals across the capital, the first wave of emergency admissions began to arrive. Elderly patients, those with chronic bronchitis, young children struggling to breathe, they came in trickles at first. The doctors and nurses, accustomed to London fogs, treated them with the standard remedies: oxygen, warm drinks, reassurance that the fog would lift soon. No one yet realized they were witnessing the beginning of a catastrophe. Dr. Harold Himsworth, a physician at University College Hospital, noticed something odd that Saturday afternoon. The patients weren't improving as they usually did. The usual treatments seemed almost futile against this particular fog. There was something qualitatively different about this one, he later wrote in his memoirs. The patients' lips were blue, their breathing labored in a way I'd never quite seen before, and they kept coming, more and more of them. As Saturday night fell, the smog grew denser still, if that seemed possible. The street lamps created pale yellow halos in the murk, but illuminated nothing. Pedestrians walked with hands outstretched, feeling their way along familiar streets rendered alien and threatening. Some became so disoriented, they walked into the Thames, necessitating rescue by the river police, who themselves could barely navigate by instrument alone. In Whitehall, the wheels of government continued to turn, but slowly. The smog had affected even the grand buildings of state. Officials arriving for work on Saturday morning found their offices filled with the same yellow haze that blanketed the streets. Some opened windows, hoping for fresh air, only to make matters worse. The acrid fog poured in, making eyes water and throats burn. The Ministry of Health received its first reports of unusually high mortality figures that evening. Civil servants, trained in the British tradition of sang-froid, noted the numbers with concern, but not yet alarm. Fogs were a fact of life in London. This one was severe, certainly, but it would pass. It always did. What they didn't know, what nobody yet understood, was that the lethal fog had barely begun its work, and the worst was still to come. Chapter 2. The City That Couldn't Breathe. Sunday, 6th December dawned, though dawned is perhaps too generous a word. The sun existed somewhere above the yellow pall, but Londoners saw only a dim, jaundiced glow that provided neither warmth nor proper light. The smog had not lifted overnight as many had hoped. Instead, it had thickened further, achieving a density that defied belief. Reverend William Thompson of St. Paul's Cathedral attempted to hold morning services. Only a handful of parishioners made it through the fog. Those who did arrived gasping and coughing, their faces smudged with soot. "I couldn't see the altar from the pulpit," Reverend Thompson later recalled. The great cathedral, that magnificent space, was reduced to a yellow twilight. I cut the service short. It seemed inappropriate to ask the Almighty's blessing while we could barely draw breath in His house. For those with respiratory conditions, Sunday became a fight for survival. Mrs. Dorothy Evans, a 67-year-old widow from Hackney, had suffered from chronic bronchitis for years. Her daughter Margaret had stayed with her through Saturday night, increasingly alarmed by her mother's worsening condition. She was struggling so badly to breathe, Margaret remembered decades later, tears still evident. "I wanted to call an ambulance, but Mum wouldn't hear of it. 'Don't make a fuss, dear,' she kept saying. 'It's just the fog. It'll pass.' But the ambulances were overwhelmed in any case. The London ambulance service, already stretched thin by post-war austerity, found itself dealing with a surge in emergency calls that exceeded anything in peacetime memory. Drivers attempting to reach patients found themselves virtually blind, crawling through streets they knew intimately but could no longer recognize. Some emergency calls went unanswered for hours. Others never received a response at all. At the London hospital in Whitechapel, the casualty department was in chaos. Dr. Peter Wilkins, a junior doctor on duty that weekend, later described scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "They just kept coming," he said in a 1977 interview. "Old people mostly, but also young children, even some in the prime of life. All struggling to breathe, all with that same awful blue tinge to their lips. We ran out of oxygen cylinders. We ran out of beds. Eventually, we ran out of hope for some of them. The wards filled beyond capacity. Patients lay on trolleys in corridors, in waiting rooms, anywhere a space could be found. Nurses worked double shifts, then triple shifts, their own eyes streaming from the smog that pervaded even the hospital's interior. The morgues began to fill as well, though the true scale of the dying would not become clear for days yet. In the more affluent areas of London, those with the means attempted to flee. Some families packed their cars and attempted to drive out of the city, only to find themselves stranded on roads where visibility was measured in inches rather than yards. One family from Kensington spent Sunday night trapped in their Austin, unable to move forward or back, breathing through handkerchiefs soaked in water while they waited for dawn and, they hoped, clearer air. The smog played no favourites, however. It infiltrated the grand houses of Mayfair as readily as the terraced homes of the East End. Lady Moira Ashford, hosting what was meant to be an elegant Sunday luncheon in her Belgravia townhouse, found her guests arriving late and dishevelled, their fine clothes reeking of sulphur. "We tried to carry on as normal," she wrote in her diary, later published, "but it was quite impossible. The fog was in the dining room, at the table with us. We could taste it in the wine. We abandoned the meal, and everyone went home, those who could find their way at any rate. Children, confined indoors by anxious parents, pressed their faces to windows and saw nothing but yellow. Some thought it exciting at first, an adventure, but the novelty wore off quickly as the reality of their confinement became clear. Schools would remain closed Monday. Shops were shuttering early or not opening at all. Normal life was suspended. In working-class areas where many families depended on coal for heating and cooking, a cruel dilemma presented itself. The very fires that kept them warm were contributing to the killer smog outside. But stopping the fires meant cold homes and no hot food. Most people chose warmth and meals, adding their small contribution to the vast pall that was smothering the city. They had no choice, really. This was December in post-war Britain, a time when prosperity was still a distant promise and mere survival occupied most people's daily concerns. The government's response remained muted. On Sunday evening, the Ministry of Health issued a statement advising people with respiratory conditions to stay indoors and avoid exertion. It was advice that seemed almost laughably inadequate to those already struggling to breathe within their own homes. No state of emergency was declared. No extraordinary measures were taken. The official stance remained that this was, while severe, ultimately just another London fog. But in hospitals and surgeries across the capital, medical professionals were beginning to realise they were dealing with something unprecedented. The death rate was climbing in ways that no ordinary fog could explain. Dr. Horace Jules, medical officer for the London County Council, spent Sunday evening reviewing mortality reports with growing alarm. The numbers were wrong. They had to be wrong. No fog, however thick, could kill this many people this quickly. He was about to discover that the numbers were, if anything, underestimating the true horror of what was unfolding. As Sunday night fell and the smog showed no signs of abating, the death toll was accelerating. In homes across London, elderly people slipped away in their sleep, their failing lungs unable to process the toxic air. Babies struggled in their cots, their underdeveloped respiratory systems overwhelmed. The young and healthy found themselves gasping, frightened by their own body's betrayal. Monday would bring no relief, only the growing realization that London was in the grip of a disaster unlike any it had faced in peacetime. The fog was not dispersing, the dying continued, and still the authorities hesitated to acknowledge the full scale of the catastrophe unfolding in the very heart of Britain. Chapter 3. The invisible killer tightens its grip. By Monday, 7th December, London had become a city under siege by an enemy it could neither see clearly nor fight effectively. The smog had been thick for 3 days now, and its effects were multiplying in ways that would only become clear with hindsight. What had begun as an inconvenience had escalated into a public health emergency that the authorities were only beginning to comprehend. The undertakers of London found themselves overwhelmed. In Shoreditch, funeral director Harold Benson later described Monday as the day he knew something was profoundly wrong. "We'd had perhaps 5 or 6 bookings for the week," he recalled. "By Monday afternoon we'd received 23 calls. By Tuesday we'd stopped counting. We simply couldn't keep up." The same was happening to every funeral home in the city. The bodies were piling up faster than they could be processed. Mortuaries designed to handle perhaps a dozen deceased at a time found themselves with 50, then 100. Hospitals had to requisition additional storage space. Some resorted to keeping bodies in corridors, covered with sheets, waiting for collection that might be days away. Doris Blake, a 34-year-old mother of 3 from Poplar, kept a diary during those terrible days. Her entry for Monday is particularly poignant. "Can't see across the street. Jimmy has a terrible cough, sounds like he's choking. Took him to the doctor but had to wait 3 hours. Doctor looked exhausted, said give him warm water with honey and keep him comfortable. What else can we do? The fog is everywhere, Even in the house, though, I've stuffed rags in every crack. Mr. Henderson from next door died this morning. His wife found him in his chair, just 58 years old. They said it was his heart, but we all know it was this damned fog. The economic impact was mounting as well. With transport at a standstill, goods couldn't reach shops, workers couldn't reach factories. The Port of London was effectively closed, ships anchored in the Thames unable to navigate. The financial losses were estimated in the millions, money that post-war Britain could ill afford to lose. Some businesses attempted to carry on. The Billingsgate Fish Market opened Monday morning, more out of habit than practical necessity. Fish merchants stood in the fog, hawking wares that neither they nor their customers could properly see. Quality control became impossible when you couldn't examine the fish in front of you. Most gave up by mid-morning and went home to wait it out. In Westminster, the political implications were beginning to dawn on officials. This was not just a medical emergency or an economic disruption. It was rapidly becoming a political crisis. Yet the government's response remained tentative, hamstrung by a combination of fiscal conservatism, limited understanding of the problem's scale, and a very British reluctance to appear alarmist. Minister of Health Ian MacLeod received increasingly urgent briefings throughout Monday. The mortality data, still incomplete and days behind the actual deaths, suggested something catastrophic was occurring. But declaring an emergency would require admitting that the government had no immediate solution to offer. What could be done, after all? You couldn't simply order the fog to disperse. The BBC, meanwhile, continued its regular programming with minimal acknowledgement of the crisis. News bulletins mentioned the fog, certainly, and advised caution. But there was no sense of urgency, no special broadcasts, no interruption of the light programme's cheerful music. It was a peculiarly British response to disaster. Keep calm and carry on, even as people died in their homes. For those with the knowledge to understand what was happening, Monday brought a creeping horror. Dr. Eric Cassell, a public health physician, spent the day reviewing what data he could gather. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Deaths were concentrated among the elderly, the very young, and those with pre-existing respiratory or cardiac conditions. But healthy adults were falling ill too, their lungs unable to cope with the toxic mix of sulfur dioxide, smoke particles, and other pollutants that saturated every breath. I realized on Monday that we were witnessing a mass poisoning, Dr. Cassell later wrote. The entire population of London was being slowly asphyxiated by industrial pollution, and we had no antidote, no treatment beyond the most basic supportive care. We were helpless. The smog had reduced London to a pre-industrial pace of life in the midst of the 20th century. People navigated by memory and touch, feeling their way along familiar routes. Shops that managed to open did so with candles and torches, creating eerie, shadowy spaces where customers and shopkeepers alike moved like ghosts through the yellow murk. At Smithfield Market, the death toll among livestock climbed. Prize cattle that had survived the journey from farms across Britain succumbed to the foul air. The animals' deaths were recorded and counted, making them among the few casualties of the smog for which there would be immediate documentation. The human toll was still being vastly underestimated. Tuesday morning brought no improvement. The high-pressure system remained stubbornly in place, the temperature inversion intact. The pollution of 3.5 days had accumulated into a toxic soup that coated every surface, infiltrated every space, and poisoned every breath. The color of the smog had deepened from yellow to a sickly greenish-brown. Those forced to venture outside returned with their faces blackened, their lungs burning, their clothes reeking of chemicals. In the East End, community spirit manifested in practical ways. Neighbours checked on the elderly and infirm, bringing food and water, stoking fires, providing what comfort they could. But kindness couldn't breathe for those whose lungs were failing. Many who went to check on friends and neighbours found them dead in their beds, having slipped away during the night as the toxic air slowly suffocated them. The hospitals were now in crisis. Staff worked without sleep, sustained by tea and determination. But determination couldn't manufacture oxygen cylinders or hospital beds. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a GP in Bethnal Green, later described Tuesday as the day she truly understood the scale of what was happening. "I was called to 3 houses in one street," she remembered. "All 3 patients, an elderly woman, a middle-aged man with bronchitis, and a 4-year-old child, died before I could get them to hospital. I stood in that street, unable to see more than a few feet, and realized I was watching my patients die, and there was nothing I could do to save them." The true horror of Tuesday was what it revealed. The smog was not going to lift on its own, not yet. The weather pattern showed no signs of breaking. The pollution continued to accumulate, and people continued to die, their numbers growing with each passing hour, though the official count would remain tragically incomplete for weeks to come. As Tuesday night fell, bringing with it the 4th night of the killer smog, London faced a terrible question. How much worse could this get? The answer, as Wednesday would reveal, was worse than anyone yet imagined. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. Wednesday, 9th December 1952, began as a turning point, though not in the way Londoners had desperately hoped. The smog remained as thick as ever, but something else was beginning to break: the city's capacity to cope with the ongoing disaster. The ambulance service had effectively collapsed. With vehicles unable to navigate and crews working beyond exhaustion, response times had become meaningless. People calling 999 were told to make their own way to hospital if possible, cruel advice for those struggling to breathe. Some attempted it, supported by family members, feeling their way through the streets. Many collapsed before reaching help. In Deptford, 23-year-old Robert Patterson carried his mother Annie on his back for nearly a mile to reach the nearest hospital. She weighed nothing by then, he later recalled, his voice still thick with emotion, decades after the event. The illness had wasted her away. But even so, it was the hardest journey of my life. I couldn't see where I was going. I fell twice, and each time I was terrified I'd hurt her. When we finally got to the hospital, they said they'd do what they could, but I could see in their eyes they didn't think she'd make it. She died that evening. I was holding her hand. The shortage of coffins became acute. Undertakers placed desperate orders with manufacturers who themselves were struggling to operate with workers unable to reach their premises. The London Coffin Company in Bethnal Green worked around the clock, but demand still outstripped supply. Some funeral directors resorted to using coffins intended for future use, leaving themselves without stock for the weeks ahead. At cemeteries across London, the grim work of burial became a logistical nightmare. Gravediggers, themselves affected by the smog, struggled to prepare plots in the thick fog. Some funerals had to be postponed because mourners simply couldn't find the cemetery gates. Others proceeded with only a handful of attendees, the rest unable or unwilling to risk the journey through the toxic air. The coal merchants, meanwhile, were doing unprecedented business. With people trapped indoors and temperatures dropping, the demand for heating fuel soared. Every fire lit added more smoke to the already saturated atmosphere. But the alternative was hypothermia. It was a vicious cycle that nobody knew how to break. In middle-class suburbs, where some homes had gas heating, families fared marginally better. But gas supplies were strained too, and power cuts added to the misery. The fog interfered with electrical equipment. Power stations, struggling to operate in the murk, couldn't maintain full output. Rolling blackouts left entire neighborhoods in darkness, with only candles and oil lamps for illumination. The psychological toll was mounting alongside the physical casualties. Dr. Edwin Fisher, a psychiatrist at the Maudsley Hospital, noted a sharp increase in patients presenting with what we might now call acute anxiety or panic attacks. The fog was literally suffocating, he later wrote, but it was also metaphorically suffocating people's spirits. The inability to see the sky, to know when or if this would end, the constant reminder of mortality every time one drew breath, it was profoundly traumatizing for many. Children were particularly affected. Susan Harper, then aged 7, recalled in a 2002 interview, "I thought it would never end. I thought the world had gone yellow forever. I had nightmares about it for years afterwards, dreams of being trapped in yellow fog that just kept getting thicker and thicker until I couldn't breathe. Even now, on a foggy day, I feel a little flutter of panic. The government finally began to take more concrete action on Wednesday, though many would later argue it was too little, too late. Additional doctors and nurses were deployed to the worst affected areas. The Ministry of Health issued stronger warnings about the dangers of exertion. Civil servants worked to compile accurate mortality data, though the full picture would remain elusive for months. In Parliament, MPs began asking pointed questions. Why had the government not acted sooner? What was being done to help those affected? When would the smog clear? The answers were unsatisfying because, in truth, the government had no good answers. This was unprecedented. All they could do was treat the symptoms and wait for the weather to change. Industrial production, already hampered by transport difficulties, ground to a near halt. Factories that had attempted to continue operating found their workers unable to breathe in the smog-filled environments. Some factory owners finally made the decision to close temporarily, adding to the economic toll, but perhaps saving lives in the process. The smog was also revealing uncomfortable truths about British society. In the wealthier western suburbs, where houses were larger and better ventilated, where medical care was more readily available, the death rate was lower. In the cramped, poorly ventilated housing of the East End, where poverty and pollution had always gone hand in hand, people died in far greater numbers. The smog was a democratic killer, but it found easier victims among the poor and vulnerable. Wednesday afternoon brought the first hint of meteorological hope. Weather forecasters noticed a change in the upper atmosphere patterns. A weather front was approaching from the Atlantic, bringing with it the prospect of wind, blessed wind that might finally disperse the killing fog. But the front was still 24 hours away, perhaps more. Another night of the smog lay ahead. For some, that night would be their last. In nursing homes across the city, the death rate accelerated. Staff, themselves exhausted and ill, watched helplessly as their charges slipped away. The Nightingale nursing home in Camberwell lost 9 residents in a single night. The matron, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, later described feeling like a witness to mass murder, though the killer was invisible and impossible to apprehend. In the affluent neighbourhood of Hampstead, the Rothschild family's butler found his elderly employer, Lord Rothschild's uncle, dead in his study Wednesday evening. The man had been healthy for his age, active, with no known respiratory issues. The post-mortem would reveal lungs blackened with soot, damage consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme pollution. He had quite literally been poisoned by the air in his own home. Emergency provisions were becoming scarce. Milk deliveries had ceased. Bread was in short supply, with bakeries unable to receive flour shipments. Some greengrocers attempted deliveries using handcarts, feeling their way through familiar routes, but it was dangerous work, and many gave up. Families survived on tinned goods and whatever they had in their larders. The BBC finally interrupted regular programming Wednesday evening for a special bulletin. The newsreader, his voice grave, acknowledged that London was facing an atmospheric crisis of unprecedented severity. He advised all who could to remain indoors, to avoid exertion, to check on vulnerable neighbours. It was helpful advice, but came 3.5 days too late for the thousands who had already perished. As Wednesday night descended, bringing with it the 5th night of the Great Smog, London waited. The promised weather front might arrive Thursday. It might bring wind and rain to wash the air clean. Or it might stall, prolonging the agony further. Nobody could say with certainty. All they could do was endure and hope, and pray that the dawn would finally bring clear air. In homes across the city, people sat by their fires, breathing air thick with smoke, and wondered how many more would die before this ended. The answer, though they didn't know it yet, was already in the thousands, and the full death toll would take months to calculate. But the long night of 9th December was the last they would have to endure. Relief was finally coming, though it would arrive too late for far too many. Chapter 5. The Wind Changes. Thursday, 10th December 1952, began like the 4 days before it, thick, yellow, suffocating. But by mid-morning, Londoners noticed something remarkable. The fog was thinning. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but perceptibly. A breeze, barely strong enough to flutter a curtain, had begun to move the stagnant air. The weather front had arrived. Cold, clean Atlantic air was pushing into the Thames Valley, finally breaking the high-pressure system that had held London in its grip for 5 days. By noon, people could see across the street. By early afternoon, the sun became visible for the first time since Friday. A pale, watery disk, but the sun nonetheless. By evening, the smog had largely dispersed, leaving behind a city stunned by what it had endured. The immediate relief was palpable. People ventured outside, taking tentative breaths of air that, while cold and damp, was blessedly clean. Neighbors emerged to check on one another, to share stories of survival, to count their losses. The streets, silent and empty for days, filled again with the sounds of human activity. But the clearing of the fog revealed the full extent of the disaster. The buildings of London were coated in a thick black residue, a toxic deposit of coal tar, sulfur compounds, and other pollutants. It would take weeks to clean, and some surfaces would never fully recover. The statue of Eros in Piccadilly Circus was black. The white walls of the National Gallery were grey. Every window needed washing, every surface wiping down. More distressing was the human cost, which was only beginning to emerge. Hospital wards remained full. The morgues were overwhelmed. And the dying continued, even with clean air returning. Thousands had been so badly affected by the toxic smog that their bodies could not recover. In the days and weeks following the smog's dispersal, people continued to succumb to its effects: pneumonia, heart failure, respiratory collapse. Dr. Richard Doll, an epidemiologist who would later become famous for establishing the link between smoking and lung cancer, began analyzing the mortality data almost immediately. What he found was staggering. In the week of the smog, approximately 4,000 more people died in London than would normally be expected. In the following weeks and months, as the delayed effects claimed more lives, the death toll climbed higher still. The final official count would be approximate, as it had to be. Many death certificates cited immediate causes like heart failure or pneumonia, without explicitly linking them to the smog. But the statistical analysis was clear. The Great Smog had killed at least 4,000 people, possibly as many as 12,000 when long-term effects were included. It remains the deadliest air pollution event in British history, and one of the worst environmental disasters in the Western world. The victims came from all walks of life, though certain patterns were clear. The elderly had been most vulnerable, their aging respiratory and cardiovascular systems unable to cope with the toxic assault. Infants and young children had suffered terribly, their developing lungs overwhelmed. Those with pre-existing conditions, bronchitis, asthma, heart disease, had died in disproportionate numbers. But healthy adults had died too. People in the prime of life, struck down by air that was, quite literally, poisonous. The smog had been a cocktail of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, soot, tar particles, and other pollutants, a toxic mix that no human respiratory system was designed to process. Breathing it was like slowly drowning in industrial waste. The economic impact was vast. The 5 days of the smog had cost the British economy millions of pounds in lost productivity, damaged goods, disrupted trade, and medical expenses. The funeral industry alone had been overwhelmed, with costs spiraling as undertakers struggled to meet unprecedented demand. But beyond the immediate statistics and economic losses, the Great Smog had revealed uncomfortable truths about modern urban life. London, the heart of the British Empire, a city that prided itself on civilization and progress, had been brought to its knees by its own pollution. The coal that heated homes and powered industry had become a weapon of mass destruction when trapped in the wrong atmospheric conditions. In the weeks following the disaster, a remarkable silence descended from official sources. There was no immediate public inquiry, no emergency legislation, no dramatic government response. The smog was mentioned in Parliament, of course, but often in passing, as if it were merely an unfortunate weather event rather than a preventable disaster caused by industrial pollution and inadequate environmental regulation. This silence was partly political calculation, acknowledging the full scale of the disaster would require admitting governmental failure to protect public health. But it was also cultural. Britain in 1952 was still a nation shaped by the war years, accustomed to stoic endurance of hardship. The stiff upper lip was not merely a cliché, but a genuine cultural expectation. To complain too loudly about the smog might seem unpatriotic, even weak. Some victims' families, however, refused to stay silent. Mrs. Florence Green, who lost both her parents in the smog, wrote to her MP demanding action. "My mother and father survived the Blitz," she wrote. "They survived rationing and hardship. They did not survive the air of London. This is unconscionable. If the government will not act to protect its citizens from poisonous air, what is it good for?" Her letter, and thousands like it, slowly built pressure for change. Medical professionals, having witnessed the carnage firsthand, began organizing. The British Medical Association called for urgent action on air pollution. Public health officials compiled damning reports on the link between industrial emissions and mortality. The public, too, was changing. The Great Smog had been a collective trauma that could not be easily forgotten or dismissed. People had experienced firsthand the terror of not being able to breathe, of watching their loved ones struggle for air, of feeling their own bodies betray them. They had learned that modern urban life carried risks that previous generations never faced. Slowly, reluctantly, the political establishment began to move. A committee was established to investigate air pollution and recommend solutions. Public hearings were held. Evidence was gathered from medical experts, industrial representatives, and affected citizens. The wheels of government, having been slow to respond during the crisis, began to turn. But meaningful change would take years, not months. The vested interests were powerful: coal companies, industrial manufacturers, power station operators. They argued that pollution controls would harm the economy, destroy jobs, make Britain less competitive. Some even questioned whether the smog had really been as deadly as claimed, suggesting that the death toll was exaggerated. The data, however, was undeniable. The statistical analysis showed beyond doubt that thousands had died as a direct result of the smog. The hospitals had the records, the undertakers had the receipts, the cemeteries had the newly filled graves. No amount of denial could erase those facts. For the survivors, particularly those who had lost loved ones, the aftermath of the smog was a time of mourning and anger. They had suffered a disaster that was, in many ways, more traumatic than the Blitz. The bombs had been an external enemy, clear and comprehensible. The smog had been insidious, arising from everyday activities, heating homes, powering factories, living normal urban lives. The Great Smog forced Britain to confront the costs of industrialization in a way it never had before. For a century and a half, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, smoke and fog had been accepted as the price of progress. "Where there's muck, there's brass," went the saying. Pollution was seen as evidence of productivity, of prosperity, of Britain's industrial might. The smog of December 1952 shattered that complacency. It proved that industrial pollution was not merely an aesthetic problem or a minor inconvenience. It was a killer, as deadly as any disease, as destructive as any weapon. And it demanded a response commensurate with the threat it posed. As 1952 turned to 1953 and the immediate crisis faded into memory, the question remained: would Britain find the political will to clean its air, or would economic concerns and industrial lobbying prevent meaningful reform? The answer would shape not only Britain's future, but set a precedent for environmental regulation across the developed world. The victims of the Great Smog deserved more than mourning. They deserved change. Chapter 6: The Reckoning and Reform. The immediate aftermath of the Great Smog saw a flurry of activity as authorities, medical professionals, and the public tried to understand what had happened and why. The death toll continued to climb through December and into early 1953 as those weakened by the toxic air succumbed to secondary infections and organ failure. Hospitals remained busy, treating patients whose lungs had been scarred, whose hearts had been strained, whose bodies would never fully recover. The media, which had been relatively quiet during the smog itself, now turned its attention to the disaster. Newspapers ran feature stories about victims, about overwhelmed hospitals, about the failure of government to respond adequately. The Times published a particularly scathing editorial on the 15th of December, noting that a civilized nation in the 20th century should not permit its citizens to be poisoned by the air they breathe. The political pressure was mounting, but resistance remained fierce. The Minister of Health, Ian MacLeod, found himself in an impossible position. Asked to explain why more hadn't been done during the smog, he could only offer the weak defense that the government had believed it would pass quickly, as fogs usually did. Asked what would be done to prevent future occurrences, he promised inquiries and consideration, but offered no concrete commitments. Behind the scenes, civil servants were compiling a comprehensive report on the disaster. The Beaver Committee, named after its chairman Sir Hugh Beaver, was tasked with investigating air pollution in London and recommending solutions. The committee's work would take months, but its eventual findings would be damning. Meanwhile, individual stories of loss and survival continued to emerge. The Thornton family from Stepney had lost 3 generations in the smog: a grandmother, a father, and a 3-month-old baby. The mother, Ellen Thornton, survived, but was left alone with her grief and her 2 older children. Her story, featured in the Daily Mirror, became emblematic of the smog's cruel indiscriminacy. In medical circles, the smog prompted serious discussions about public health priorities. The focus on infectious diseases that had dominated the post-war years was clearly insufficient. Environmental health, the quality of air, water, and living conditions, demanded equal attention. Dr. Horace Jules, who had first recognized the severity of the crisis, became a vocal advocate for pollution control, arguing that the right to clean air was as fundamental as the right to clean water. The coal industry, sensing the political winds shifting, mounted a defensive campaign. Coal was the backbone of British energy, they argued. It heated homes, powered factories, generated electricity. Restricting its use would harm the economy and lower living standards. They suggested that the smog had been an unfortunate anomaly, unlikely to recur, not worth disrupting the energy supply to prevent. But the public was no longer willing to accept such reassurances. Letters poured into newspapers and parliamentary offices demanding action. Civic groups organized, calling for clean air legislation. Even the typically conservative British public had reached a breaking point. They had endured rationing, austerity, and hardship during and after the war. Being slowly poisoned by their own industrial progress was a bridge too far. The Beaver Committee delivered its report in November 1954, nearly 2 years after the Great Smog. Its conclusions were stark. Air pollution in British cities posed a serious threat to public health. The current levels of smoke and sulfur emissions were unacceptable. Immediate action was needed to reduce pollution from domestic coal fires, industrial emissions, and power stations. The report recommended the creation of smoke control areas, where only smokeless fuels could be burned. It called for subsidies to help households transition from coal to cleaner heating sources. It proposed stricter regulations on industrial emissions and higher chimneys to better disperse unavoidable pollution. The recommendations were comprehensive, evidence-based, and politically difficult. But the political landscape had shifted. The memory of the Great Smog, reinforced by subsequent smaller smog events, had created a public demand for action that politicians could no longer ignore. In 1956, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act, the first major piece of environmental legislation in British history. The act wasn't perfect. It was less stringent than some advocates wanted. It included compromises to appease industrial interests. Implementation would be gradual, taking years to achieve full compliance. But it was a start, a recognition that the state had a responsibility to protect its citizens from environmental harm. The Act established smoke control areas in urban centres where only smokeless coal or alternative fuels could be burned. It provided grants to help households install cleaner heating systems. It set emission standards for factories and required them to use the best available technology to reduce pollution. Violating the act could result in fines and, in extreme cases, imprisonment. The changes were not immediate. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, Londoners still experienced bad fogs, though none approached the lethality of December 1952. The transition from coal to cleaner fuels was gradual, hampered by economic constraints and the natural resistance to change. Working-class families, who had always relied on cheap coal, found the adjustment particularly difficult. The Electricity Board promoted all-electric homes as the modern, clean alternative to coal. Gas companies advertised their product as a cleaner fuel. Slowly, the domestic landscape changed. The characteristic coal scuttle and fire grate, once ubiquitous in British homes, became less common. Central heating, previously a luxury of the wealthy, became more widespread. Industrial pollution proved harder to control. Factory owners resisted expensive modifications to their equipment. Power stations, essential to the nation's electricity supply, negotiated exemptions and delays. But the direction of change was irreversible. The social contract had shifted. Profit was no longer the sole consideration. Public health mattered too. By the late 1960s, the air in London was noticeably cleaner. The pea soup fogs that had characterized the city for a century were becoming rare. Winter air, while still cold and damp, was no longer toxic. Children could play outside without their mothers worrying they'd be poisoned. The elderly could breathe more easily. The human cost of the transition was real. Coal miners lost jobs as demand for their product declined. The coal industry, once the pride of British industrial might, entered a long decline. Communities built around mining faced economic hardship. But set against the alternative, continuing to poison millions of city dwellers, most accepted the necessity of change. The Great Smog's legacy extended far beyond Britain. It became a case study in environmental disaster, studied by public health officials and urban planners worldwide. Cities across Europe and North America, facing their own air pollution crises, looked to the British response as a model, both for what to do and, in its initial inadequacy, what not to do. The smog also contributed to the growing environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s. It provided concrete evidence that industrial activity could have catastrophic health consequences, that regulation was necessary, that markets alone would not protect public welfare. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, drew explicit parallels between chemical pollution and air pollution, both invisible killers that demanded governmental response. In medical research, the smog prompted long-term studies into the effects of air pollution on human health. The pioneering work of epidemiologists like Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill, examining the links between environmental exposures and disease, owed much to the questions raised by the 1952 disaster. Their methodologies would later be applied to studying everything from smoking to asbestos to radiation exposure. For those who lived through the Great Smog, the memory never fully faded. Even decades later, survivors could recall the yellow darkness, the acrid smell, the struggle to breathe, the fear that it might never end. Some developed chronic respiratory problems that they attributed to those 5 days in December. Others carried psychological scars, a lingering anxiety triggered by heavy fog or poor air quality. The graveyards of London hold thousands whose deaths, while attributed to various immediate causes, were fundamentally caused by the Great Smog. Many died in the days and weeks immediately following, but others' lives were shortened by years or decades. The man who died of heart failure in 1960 might have lived to 1970 if his heart hadn't been weakened in 1952. The woman who succumbed to pneumonia in 1955 might have survived if her lungs hadn't been damaged. The true death toll will never be known with certainty. Memorials to the Great Smog are few. There is no grand monument, no annual day of remembrance. Perhaps this reflects British reticence about dwelling on disaster. Or perhaps it reflects discomfort with acknowledging that thousands died from something as mundane as air pollution, from the byproducts of everyday life, rather than war or natural catastrophe. But the memory persists in other ways. in the Clean Air Act and its successors, in the environmental regulations that now govern industrial activity, in the expectation that governments have a duty to protect public health, in the understanding that economic growth cannot come at any cost, that some prices are too high to pay. The story of the Great Smog is ultimately a story of learning and change, albeit change that came too late for thousands. It demonstrated that modern life poses risks that previous generations never imagined, and that addressing those risks requires collective action, governmental authority, and a willingness to prioritize long-term health over short-term economic gain. As Britain moved through the second half of the 20th century, air quality steadily improved. By the 1980s, the lethal fogs were a memory. By the 2000s, a new generation had grown up, never experiencing the choking smogs their grandparents had endured. Clean air, once taken for granted, then lost, then fought for and regained, had become a basic expectation of modern British life. Yet the lessons of the Great Smog remain relevant. Air pollution continues to kill, though now it's subtler: particulate matter from diesel engines, nitrogen oxides from traffic, ozone from industrial processes. The World Health Organization estimates that air pollution causes millions of deaths worldwide each year. In developing nations experiencing rapid industrialization, cities face air quality crises that echo 1952 London. The Great Smog teaches us that environmental disasters are preventable, that regulation works, that public health can be protected when there is sufficient political will. It also teaches us that delay costs lives, that vested interests will always argue for inaction, that the vulnerable always pay the highest price. Those 5 days in December 1952 changed Britain forever. They demonstrated that progress without prudence leads to disaster, that the invisible can be deadly, that the air we breathe, something so fundamental we rarely think about it, cannot be taken for granted. The thousands who died in the Great Smog were not casualties of war or natural disaster, but of industrial society's failure to consider the consequences of its own success. Their legacy is the cleaner air we breathe today, the regulations that protect public health, the recognition that economic development must be sustainable and safe. They paid a terrible price for lessons that seem obvious in hindsight, but were hard-won in practice. Britain emerged from the smog a changed nation, more aware of the fragility of health, more willing to regulate industry, more conscious of the environment. It was a transformation born of tragedy, but a transformation nonetheless. The Great Smog of 1952 stands as a dark monument to the dangers of unchecked industrialization and governmental complacency. But it also stands as proof that societies can learn, can change, can choose public health over profit when the cost of inaction becomes undeniable. In that sense, the story is not merely one of disaster, but of eventual redemption, purchased at far too high a price, but redemption nonetheless.